Some people think revenge is loud. They imagine shouting, public humiliation, or watching someone lose everything overnight. I used to think that too. But I learned something different. Sometimes the most unforgettable revenge happens so quietly that the other person doesn't even realize they've already lost, until they're sitting across the table from you, begging for a second chance. A few months ago, an elegant woman walked into my office wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than my first year's rent. Her makeup was perfect. Her confidence wasn't. She looked exhausted, desperate, like someone who had spent months trying to stop her entire world from collapsing. She didn't recognize me. Not after all those years. She smiled politely, reached across the conference table, and said, "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Your investment could save my company." I smiled back, because she had no idea. The woman asking me to save her business was the same aunt who once looked me in the eyes and told everyone at a family gathering that I would never become anything in life. She thought I was just another wealthy investor. She had absolutely no idea who I really was. And that's where this story begins. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 33 years old and I live in Seattle, Washington. If you met me today, you'd probably assume I grew up with every opportunity in the world. You'd see the company I own, the house overlooking the water, the black SUV waiting outside my office, and you'd think success came naturally. It didn't. Everything I have today was built on years of rejection, humiliation, heartbreak, and one promise I made to myself when I was 16 years old. Never let the people who underestimated you decide who you become. My father, Daniel Bennett, drove a city bus for nearly 30 years. He left home before sunrise every morning and came back long after dark, smelling like diesel fuel and exhaustion. My mother, Susan Bennett, worked double shifts at a small neighborhood diner. Neither of them ever complained. Money was always tight. There were months when paying the electric bill meant eating inexpensive meals for 2 weeks. Birthdays were simple. Christmas presents were modest. Vacations didn't exist. But despite everything we didn't have, my parents somehow managed to fill our little house with laughter. They loved each other. They loved me. And for a long time, I believed that was enough. Then there was my father's older sister, Victoria Henderson. If my parents represented humility, Aunt Victoria represented wealth. She lived in Bellevue in a mansion that looked more like a luxury hotel than a family home. Imported marble floors, crystal chandeliers, luxury cars lined up in the driveway, professional landscaping, private security. She and her husband owned Henderson Industrial Solutions, a manufacturing company that supplied parts to several major corporations across the country. Everyone in the family admired them, or at least pretended to, because being invited into Aunt Victoria's circle felt like being invited into another world. Every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter, our entire extended family gathered at her estate. Those holidays should have created happy memories. Instead, they became the reason I spent years questioning my own worth. My parents never wanted to miss family gatherings. No matter how successful someone becomes, Dad always said, family is still family. I wish he had been right. I was 15 the first time I truly understood how differently people treat you when they think your bank account defines your value. Mom had spent an entire afternoon altering a navy blue dress she found at a thrift store. She carefully adjusted the sleeves, fixed the hem, and ironed every wrinkle until it looked brand new. When she handed it to me, she smiled proudly. "You look beautiful." I believed her, until I walked into Aunt Victoria's house. Within minutes, my cousin Madison noticed the dress. She laughed loud enough for everyone in the living room to hear. "Oh my God, is that vintage or just really old?" Several relatives chuckled. I froze. I looked down at my shoes. Before I could say anything, Aunt Victoria walked over carrying a glass of wine. She looked me up and down. Then she smiled, not kindly, but with the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to hide their contempt. "Let's not embarrass her," she said. "Not everyone has the same opportunities." The room filled with awkward laughter. Nobody defended me. Nobody told her she had crossed a line. My father stood silently beside me. I saw the pain in his eyes. That hurt more than the words themselves, because I knew he blamed himself. The drive home that night was almost completely silent. Dad kept both hands on the steering wheel. Mom stared out the passenger window. No one mentioned what had happened. When we finally pulled into our driveway, Dad looked at me and quietly said, "Claire, promise me something." "What?" "Don't ever let people like that convince you you're worth less than they are." I nodded. But deep inside, I already had. That night, I opened an old notebook beside my bed and wrote one sentence across the first page. "One day, they will respect me without knowing they already should have." I had no idea that promise would shape the next 17 years of my life. The morning after that Thanksgiving, I woke up before sunrise. I couldn't stop replaying every word my aunt had said. It wasn't just the joke about my dress. It wasn't the laughter. It was the way everyone had looked at me. Like I was invisible. Like I belonged in the room only because someone had been polite enough to invite me. That feeling stayed with me for weeks. Eventually, the embarrassment turned into something else. Determination. From that day forward, I stopped worrying about what everyone else was doing. While my classmates spent weekends at parties, I was at the public library. While my cousins posted pictures from ski trips and beach vacations, I was working part-time at a grocery store after school. Every paycheck mattered. Some of it helped my parents. The rest went into a savings account. Not because I knew exactly what I wanted, but because I knew one thing. I never wanted money to control my choices the way it controlled my parents. Senior year arrived faster than I expected. My grades were among the best in the district. Teachers encouraged me to apply to several universities. The problem wasn't getting accepted. The problem was paying for it. One afternoon, my guidance counselor called me into her office. "I think you have a real chance at earning scholarships," she said. "But you'll need recommendation letters, essays, interviews, and you'll need to believe you're just as qualified as everyone else." That last sentence stayed with me, because believing in myself was still the hardest part. Months later, the acceptance letters started arriving. When I opened the envelope from the University of Washington, my hands were shaking. I had been accepted. More importantly, I had received a scholarship covering most of my tuition. My mother cried. My father hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. For the first time in years, hope felt stronger than fear. That Christmas, Aunt Victoria hosted another family gathering. Dad wanted to skip it. Mom agreed. But Grandpa insisted. "It's Christmas," he said. "Families shouldn't stay apart." Looking back, I wish we had stayed home. Halfway through dinner, everyone started talking about colleges. Madison announced she had chosen a private university in California. The room erupted in applause. Then someone asked me where I was going. "The University of Washington," I answered. I received a scholarship. For one brief second, the room was quiet. Then Aunt Victoria smiled. "A scholarship." She laughed softly. "Well, I suppose that's one way to afford college." Several relatives smiled awkwardly. She wasn't finished. "You know, Claire, people like us build companies. People with scholarships usually end up working for us." The room exploded with polite laughter. I felt my face burn. Before I could respond, my father calmly placed his fork on the table. He looked directly at his sister. For someone who's done so well in life, he said quietly. I'm surprised you still need to make a teenager feel small. The room instantly fell silent. It was the first time. The first time in my life. My father had stood up to her. Victoria's smile disappeared. She shrugged. I was only joking. Dad stood. So am I. Then he looked at Mom. Let's go home. We left before dessert. No one stopped us. No one apologized. And from that day on, we stopped attending family gatherings altogether. College changed everything. Not because life suddenly became easy. Because it didn't. I worked mornings at a coffee shop. Afternoons I attended classes. Evenings I studied. Weekends I tutored other students for extra money. Some nights I slept 4 hours. Sometimes less. There were days I wondered if my aunt had been right. Maybe people from families like mine weren't supposed to dream so big. Then something unexpected happened. During my sophomore year, one of my professors introduced me to a startup competition. The challenge was simple. Develop a business idea that solved a real problem. The winning team would receive funding. Most students arrived with polished presentations. I arrived with nothing more than a notebook full of ideas. One of those ideas changed my life. Winning the university startup competition didn't make me rich. It didn't even make my life easier. What it gave me was something far more valuable. Proof. Proof that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as ordinary as I'd spent most of my life believing. Our team won second place. The prize wasn't enormous, $50,000 in seed funding, but to me, it looked like a fortune. The judges praised our concept, using predictive software to help small manufacturers reduce waste and avoid expensive supply chain delays. Most people in the audience probably forgot our presentation before they reached the parking lot. I didn't. Because while everyone else celebrated, one of the judges approached me privately. He introduced himself as Michael Donovan. He was the founder of a successful logistics technology company. I like the way you think, he said. Your presentation wasn't perfect. He smiled. But your problem-solving was. He handed me his business card. If you're serious about building this company, call me. I stared at that card for nearly an hour after I got home. I must have picked it up and put it down 20 times. People like Michael Donovan didn't mentor people like me. At least, that's what I believed. 3 days later, I called him. That phone call changed the direction of my life. For the next 2 years, Michael became more than a mentor. He became the first successful business owner who treated me like an equal instead of a charity case. He never cared where I grew up. He never asked how much money my parents had. He cared about one thing. Could I solve problems? Whenever I made excuses, he stopped me immediately. Claire, he would say, business doesn't reward excuses. It rewards solutions. Those words became part of my daily routine. Graduation arrived before I realized how quickly time had passed. Most of my classmates accepted comfortable corporate jobs. The salaries were tempting. The benefits were even better. My parents begged me to accept one. You've worked hard enough, Mom said. You deserve some security. She wasn't wrong. After everything our family had been through, choosing stability seemed like the responsible decision. But every time I looked at those job offers, I remembered my aunt's voice. People like us build companies. She meant it as an insult. I decided to make it my goal. Not because I wanted to prove her wrong. Because I wanted to prove myself right. I turned down every job offer. Instead, I rented the smallest office I could find in Seattle. Calling it an office was generous. It was barely larger than a storage room. The carpet was stained. The paint peeled off the walls. The heating barely worked during winter. My desk came from a second-hand furniture store. My chair squeaked every time I leaned back. There were days when instant noodles were my breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Still, every morning, I unlocked that little office with a smile. Because it belonged to me. The company had only 3 people. Me, a software developer named Ethan, and my college friend Sophia, who handled operations. None of us earned real salaries. Some months, we earned nothing at all. We survived on hope, determination, and coffee. Mostly coffee. Clients were almost impossible to find. We called hundreds of businesses. Most never answered. Some hung up immediately. Others politely declined. Every rejection felt personal. Every no echoed inside my head. Sometimes, I'd stay in the office long after everyone else left. I'd stare at the whiteboard covered with business plans and wonder if my aunt had been right all along. Maybe people like me weren't meant to own companies. Maybe I should have accepted one of those safe corporate jobs. Then I'd remember my father's tired face after driving buses for 12 hours. I'd remember my mother's swollen feet after standing in a diner all day. Quitting wasn't an option. Not after everything they'd sacrificed. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, almost a year after launching the company, the phone finally rang. It wasn't a huge corporation. It wasn't a famous client. It was a family-owned manufacturing business with fewer than 50 employees. Their production costs were rising. They were losing money. Someone had recommended our software. We drove there the next morning. I gave the presentation of my life. Not because it was flawless. Because it was honest. I explained exactly how our system worked. I answered every difficult question. When I finished, the owner looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled. "We'll give you a chance." It was our first real contract. When we walked back to the car, Ethan literally started laughing. Sophia burst into tears. I just stood there, looking up at the gray Seattle sky. For the first time since starting the company, I believed we might actually survive. Little did I know, that tiny contract would soon lead to an opportunity none of us could have imagined. And somewhere across the state, a company called Henderson Industrial Solutions, my Aunt Victoria's business, had just begun facing problems no one outside the family knew about. Their sales were slowing. Major clients were quietly leaving. And for the first time in decades, Victoria Henderson was about to discover what it felt like to lose control. Our first client wasn't the biggest. It wasn't the most profitable. But it became our best advertisement. Within 6 months, that small manufacturing company had reduced production delays by nearly 30% and cut operating costs enough to hire 8 new employees. The owner couldn't stop talking about our software. He recommended us to another business. Then another. Then another. Without spending a single dollar on advertising, our reputation began spreading through the manufacturing industry. For the first time, companies were calling us instead of the other way around. It felt unreal. Every time the office phone rang, Ethan would grin and say, "Another one." Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't. But we finally had something we'd never had before. Momentum. One afternoon, Michael Donovan stopped by our office. He looked around the tiny room and laughed. I started in a place smaller than this. I smiled. "You've told me that story at least 10 times. And one day you'll tell it to someone else." He walked over to the whiteboard covered with client names. There were 12 companies listed. 12. A year earlier, there had been none. He nodded with quiet approval. "You're growing." "I hope so." "No." He looked directly at me. "I don't hope. I measure." Then he pointed to the list. "You've outgrown this office." I laughed. "We can't afford anything bigger." You can't afford to stay here. I didn't understand what he meant. Until 2 weeks later, Michael invited me to lunch at a downtown hotel. When I arrived, there were 3 people already waiting. A venture capital group from San Francisco. I almost turned around and left. I wasn't wearing designer clothes. I didn't have years of executive experience. I was 26 years old and still worrying about paying payroll every month. During lunch, they asked question after question. Revenue, growth projections, market strategy, competition, risk. I answered honestly. Whenever I didn't know something, I admitted it. By the end of the meeting, one of the investors smiled. You don't pretend to know everything. I've learned that's dangerous. He laughed. Good answer. A month later, they invested $8 million into our company. When the money hit our account, I stared at the computer screen for nearly 5 minutes. I thought the bank had made a mistake. It hadn't. For the first time in my life, money wasn't the problem anymore. Responsibility was. We moved into a real office overlooking Elliott Bay. Glass walls, conference rooms, a reception desk, an actual kitchen. I still kept my old wooden desk from the first office. Everyone told me to replace it. I refused. That scratched-up desk reminded me where I came from. It reminded me that success could disappear just as quickly as it arrived. As the company grew, so did my confidence. But one thing never changed. I never forgot my parents. The first thing I bought wasn't a sports car. It wasn't a luxury watch. It wasn't an expensive vacation. I paid off my parents' mortgage. Completely. Dad cried when I handed him the paperwork. I can't accept this. You already did. What do you mean? You accepted it the day you spent 30 years driving a bus, so I could have a better life. He hugged me so tightly, I thought he might break one of my ribs. Mom couldn't stop crying. For the first time since I was a little girl, I saw peace on their faces. That moment meant more than every business award I would ever receive. Months turned into years. Our company expanded across Washington, then Oregon, then California. We hired engineers, analysts, project managers, and executives. By my 30th birthday, we employed more than 300 people. Business magazines started calling me one of the fastest-growing entrepreneurs in the Pacific Northwest. Journalists wanted interviews. Podcasts wanted appearances. Investors wanted meetings. I accepted very few, because I had learned something important. Attention can build a reputation, but it can also destroy focus. One evening, while reviewing quarterly reports, Ethan walked into my office carrying a folder. You should see this. What is it? He placed it on my desk. Inside were industry reports. One company appeared over and over again. Henderson Industrial Solutions. I froze. I hadn't heard that name in years. They've lost 3 major contracts, Ethan said. I kept reading. Revenue was falling. Debt was increasing. Employees were leaving. Production delays were getting worse every quarter. I leaned back in my chair. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. Finally, Ethan asked, You know these people? I looked out the window at the Seattle skyline. My aunt owns that company. His eyebrows shot up. The one you've mentioned before. I nodded. The same one. He waited. So, how do you feel? It was a simple question. But I didn't have a simple answer. Part of me remembered every insult, every laugh, every family gathering where my parents had been treated like they didn't belong. Another part of me remembered something else. My father. He had never wished failure on anyone, not even his own sister. I don't know, I admitted quietly. I really don't know. A few weeks later, I received an email from an industry consultant I knew. It was short. Claire Henderson Industrial Solutions is quietly looking for outside investors. They're running out of options. Whoever acquires them could gain several valuable manufacturing contracts at a bargain price. I read the email twice. Then a third time. I slowly closed my laptop. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like if our paths ever crossed again. I pictured dramatic confrontations, angry speeches, perfect revenge. But now that the possibility was becoming real, none of those fantasies felt satisfying. Instead, I felt strangely calm. I had spent 17 years building a life she insisted I could never have. Maybe that was already the greatest revenge. I had no idea that within a few months, Victoria Henderson herself would walk into my office. Not as my wealthy aunt. Not as the woman who looked down on my family. But as someone desperately searching for a lifeline. Completely unaware that the CEO she was about to meet was the same little girl she had once humiliated in front of the entire family. 3 days after I received the email about Henderson Industrial Solutions, another message landed in my inbox. This one wasn't from an industry consultant. It was from an investment bank. The subject line read, "Confidential acquisition opportunity." Normally, those emails were forwarded directly to our mergers and acquisitions team. This time, I opened it myself. Inside was a detailed report explaining that Henderson Industrial Solutions had officially hired a financial advisory firm to search for strategic investors. The company wasn't bankrupt. Not yet. But they were dangerously close. Years of poor management, expensive expansion projects, and several failed contracts had drained their cash reserves. If they couldn't secure funding within 6 months, lenders would likely force a restructuring. I read every page. Not because I wanted to watch them fail. Because I wanted to understand how a company that had once seemed untouchable had reached this point. The answer wasn't complicated. Success had made them arrogant. They stopped adapting. They ignored technology. They dismissed younger executives who suggested change. And when the market evolved, they didn't. Their competitors did. Including us. That afternoon, I called an executive meeting. Around the conference table sat Ethan, Sophia, our chief financial officer, our legal counsel, and 2 members of our acquisitions team. I slid the Henderson file across the table. I want an honest opinion. Everyone spent the next 20 minutes reading. Finally, our CFO broke the silence. Financially, this could be one of the best acquisition opportunities we've ever seen. Sophia nodded. They still own valuable manufacturing facilities. Ethan added, and their customer relationships are worth millions if managed correctly. The room quickly shifted into business mode. Projected costs, integration plans, legal risks, potential returns. For everyone else, it was just another company. For me, it was family. Or at least it used to be. No one in the room knew that. Except Ethan. He watched me quietly. He knew this wasn't just another business decision. When the meeting ended, Ethan stayed behind. "You okay?" I smiled. "I think so. You don't sound convinced." I walked toward the window, overlooking Elliott Bay. "You know what's strange?" "What?" I spent years imagining revenge. And now that I actually have power, I don't know what revenge even looks like anymore. He leaned against the conference table. "Maybe that's because you've already won." His words stayed with me long after he left. The following week, the investment bank organized private meetings between Henderson Industrial Solutions and several potential investors. We received an invitation. The invitation included a list of attendees. My eyes immediately found one name: Victoria Henderson, Chief Executive Officer. She would personally attend every meeting. For several minutes, I simply stared at her name. I hadn't seen my aunt in almost 8 years. Not once. No phone calls. No birthday cards. No apologies. Nothing. As far as she knew. I had simply disappeared from the family. That evening, I drove to my parents' house. Dad was in the backyard watering flowers. He had finally retired. The lines on his face were deeper now. His hair had turned almost completely white. But he smiled the same way he always had. "What brings you here on a Wednesday?" "I need your advice." He immediately knew it was serious. We sat on the porch while Mom made coffee inside. I handed him the Henderson report. He didn't even need to read the first page. "I've heard." "You have?" He nodded slowly. "News travels." We sat in silence for a while. Finally, I asked the question I'd been carrying all week. "If you were me, what would you do?" Dad didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the yard. "You remember what I told you after that Thanksgiving?" I nodded. "Don't let people decide your worth." He smiled softly. "I still believe that." Then his expression became more serious. "But don't let their mistakes decide your character either." I looked at him. "So you're saying I should help them?" "No." He shook his head. "I'm saying whatever decision you make it because it's right. Not because you're angry." That was my father. Even after everything his sister had done, he refused to let bitterness control him. A week later, the first investment meeting took place in downtown Seattle. Our legal team handled most of the discussions. I chose not to attend. Not yet. Instead, our chief financial officer represented the company. When he returned that evening, he placed a folder on my desk. "They're in worse shape than we thought." "How bad?" "They've lost another major client. And they're desperate." He hesitated. Victoria Henderson asked if she'd be able to meet directly with the owner of our company. I remained silent. Our team told her that decision hadn't been made. He looked at me carefully. "I assume you don't want her knowing who you are." "Not yet." Over the next month, negotiations continued. Every report told the same story. Henderson Industrial Solutions wasn't just looking for investors anymore. They were looking for someone to save them. Banks had become impatient. Suppliers wanted payment. Employees were beginning to leave. Their options were disappearing one by one. Then, one rainy Monday morning, my assistant knocked on my office door. "Claire?" "Yes." "There's been a change." "What kind of change?" She handed me a printed email. Victoria Henderson had personally requested one final meeting. Not with our finance department. Not with our attorneys. With the CEO. With me. She didn't know my name. She had only been told that the founder and owner of our company would make the final decision. I looked at the calendar. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. 10 years. 10 long years. And after everything that had happened, the woman who once treated my family like we were beneath her was about to walk into my office, completely unaware that the little girl she had humiliated so many times was now sitting in the chair that held the power to decide the future of her company. I closed the email, took a slow breath, and whispered to myself, "She still doesn't recognize my name." For the first time, I wondered if she would recognize my face. The week before the meeting passed more slowly than any week I could remember. Every morning, I told myself it was just another business meeting. Every evening, I caught myself replaying memories I had spent years trying to forget. The navy blue thrift store dress. The laughter. The way my father stared at the steering wheel during the drive home because he didn't want me to see the tears in his eyes. I had buried those memories beneath years of hard work. Now they were all coming back. Not because they still controlled me, but because I finally had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. On Wednesday evening, Ethan knocked on my office door. "You've been here since 7 this morning." "I know. You haven't looked away from that screen in almost an hour." I smiled. "I'm thinking. Dangerous." I laughed for the first time that day. He sat across from me. "So, are you nervous?" I thought about it. "No." "Then what?" "I don't know if I want her to recognize me immediately. Or not until the meeting is over." Ethan folded his arms. "What difference does it make? If she recognizes me right away, she'll stop talking like herself. She'll become careful. And if she doesn't, I'll hear exactly who she is. Without filters. Without pretending." He nodded. "I think you've already made your decision." Maybe I had. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The receptionist informed me that our guests would arrive at 10. At 9:50, my assistant came into my office. "They're here." I stood, straightened my jacket, looked once at the framed photo sitting on the corner of my desk. It was a picture of my parents on the day I paid off their house. Whenever I doubted myself, I looked at that photograph. It reminded me why I had started. Not for revenge. For them. Instead of walking directly into the conference room, I watched through the one-way privacy glass. Victoria Henderson sat at the table with 2 executives and her attorney. Time had changed her. The confidence that once filled every room had faded. Her shoulders looked heavier. The tiny smile she used to wear had disappeared. She looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. For a brief second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered my 16-year-old self standing in that expensive living room while everyone laughed. Compassion didn't erase accountability. At exactly 10 o'clock, I opened the conference room door. Everyone stood. Victoria smiled politely. "Good morning." "Good morning." She extended her hand. "I'm Victoria Henderson." I shook it. "I'm Claire." Nothing. No recognition. No hesitation. She had absolutely no idea who I was. We all sat down. For the next 30 minutes, she presented her company. She spoke professionally, confidently. She explained market conditions, economic pressures, supply chain disruptions. Everything sounded reasonable. Until I started asking questions. "Why did 3 of your largest clients leave within 18 months? She hesitated. "Our competitors became aggressive." I nodded. "What changes did you make afterward?" "We maintained our long-term strategy." "In other words, you changed nothing." Silence. One of her executives shifted uncomfortably. I continued. "Why did 6 senior engineers resign last year?" "They pursued other opportunities." "Or they warned you about outdated technology that leadership refused to adopt." She blinked. "Where did you get that information?" I simply smiled. "I do my homework." The room became noticeably quieter. For the first time, Victoria looked uncertain. After another 20 minutes, she closed her presentation folder. "I know our company has made mistakes." She spoke more softly now. "But we've spent 40 years building something meaningful. If we receive the right investment, we can recover." There was genuine emotion in her voice. Not arrogance. Fear. I studied her carefully. This wasn't the woman I remembered. Life had humbled her. But had it changed her? That was the question. I stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seattle. Without turning around, I asked, "Ms. Henderson, can I ask you a personal question?" She seemed surprised. "Of course. Do you believe success makes someone more valuable than other people?" The room fell silent. She looked confused. "I don't think I understand." "It's a simple question. Does money determine a person's worth?" She looked down at the table. For several long seconds, she said nothing. Finally, "No." Her answer was quiet, almost ashamed. "I used to think it did, but not anymore." I slowly turned to face her. "Interesting. Because years ago, I knew someone who believed exactly that." She frowned slightly. "I don't believe we've met before." I walked back toward the table, stopped directly across from her. Then I asked one final question. "Do you remember a Thanksgiving dinner? About 10 years ago, where a teenage girl wore a navy blue dress?" Victoria's expression froze. Her eyes narrowed. She searched my face. Once, twice, then a third time. The color slowly drained from her face. Her lips parted. She whispered, "Claire," for the first time since entering the room. She truly looked at me. And suddenly, she remembered everything. The dress, the laughter, the cruel jokes, my father, my mother, every single moment. The room was completely silent. Her attorney looked confused. Her executives glanced back and forth between us. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't finish the sentence. I remained calm, because I had imagined this moment hundreds of times. But the reality felt completely different. There was no satisfaction in seeing another human being broken. Only closure. And the conversation that followed would change both of our lives forever. No one in the room said a word. The silence felt heavier than any argument ever could. Victoria Henderson remained frozen in her chair, staring at me as though she had just seen a ghost. Her attorney looked at her, then at me. Finally, he asked, "Victoria, do you two know each other?" She swallowed hard. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "She's..." She stopped. Then she looked directly into my eyes. "She's my niece." The room instantly changed. My executive team exchanged confused glances. Our legal counsel quietly closed his notebook. No one had expected this. Neither had Victoria. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she slowly stood. "I didn't recognize you." "I know. You've changed. So have you." She gave a weak smile that disappeared almost immediately. "I suppose that's true." I gestured toward the empty chair. "Please sit." She hesitated before sitting back down. The confident CEO who had entered my office an hour earlier was gone. Now she looked like someone carrying the weight of years she wished she could erase. I folded my hands on the table. "I have one question." She nodded. "When was the last time you thought about me?" She looked down. "I don't know." I waited. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Not enough." It wasn't the answer I expected. She continued. "I thought about your father more often. My brother. I knew he stopped coming to family gatherings because of me. I told myself he was being too sensitive." She laughed bitterly. "I convinced myself I had done nothing wrong." She looked back at me. I was lying to myself. One of her executives cleared his throat. "I'm sorry. I'm not sure we should be discussing family matters during a business negotiation." I turned toward him. "You're right. This is a business meeting." I paused. But sometimes the people behind a business matter just as much as the numbers. He nodded quietly and said nothing else. I opened a folder that had been sitting in front of me. Inside were detailed reports on Henderson Industrial Solutions, financial statements, debt schedules, operational analyses. Everything. I've spent the last 6 weeks studying your company. Victoria looked surprised. You have. I know exactly how much debt you're carrying. I know which suppliers you've lost. I know your payroll obligations. I know which factories are profitable and which ones are draining millions every year. Her eyes widened. You know all that. I know more than that. I slid another document across the table. Our analysts estimate that without outside funding, your company has approximately 91 days before serious cash flow failure. Her attorney glanced at the report. He slowly lowered his head. The numbers were accurate, painfully accurate. Victoria looked at me with tired eyes. I won't insult your intelligence. We're running out of time. She took a deep breath. I built that company with my husband. When he passed away, I thought I could handle everything myself. I couldn't. I refused to listen to younger executives. I rejected new technology. I thought experience alone would save us. She looked around the room. It didn't. For the first time in my life, I heard genuine humility in her voice. Not pride. Not arrogance. Just honesty. She looked back at me. I owe you an apology. I didn't interrupt. I should have apologized years ago. I embarrassed you. I embarrassed your parents. I made money my entire personality. And by the time I realized what I had become, everyone I loved had already walked away. A tear rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I am sorry. The room was silent again. Not awkward this time. Respectful. Even my executives, who knew nothing about our history, could tell that this wasn't a rehearsed apology. I leaned back in my chair. For years, I had imagined this exact moment. I thought hearing those words would feel incredible. I thought it would erase every painful memory. It didn't. Because apologies don't rewrite the past. They simply acknowledge it. And sometimes, that's enough. Sometimes it isn't. I stood and walked toward the windows again. Seattle's skyline shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Without turning around, I spoke quietly. When I was 16, I wrote something in an old notebook. Victoria listened without speaking. I wrote, "One day they will respect me without knowing they already should have." I smiled to myself. I carried those words with me for years. I thought success would heal everything. It didn't. It just gave me perspective. I turned back to face her. You know what I finally realized? She shook her head. The opposite of humiliation isn't revenge. It's dignity. Victoria lowered her head. I wish I had learned that sooner. So do I. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I returned to my seat and closed the acquisition file. I've made my decision. Every person in the room straightened. Victoria looked at me with anxious eyes. She didn't know whether I was about to save her company or let it disappear forever. I slid a single envelope across the table. You'll find my decision inside. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. She slowly opened the envelope, and the first line made her stop breathing. Victoria stared at the document inside the envelope. Her hands were trembling so badly that she had to place the papers back on the table before she could continue reading. The title read, Strategic Acquisition Proposal. She slowly looked up at me. This. Her voice cracked. This isn't an investment. I shook my head. No. It's an acquisition. The room fell completely silent. One of her executives leaned forward and quickly scanned the first page. His eyes widened. This offer purchases 100% of Henderson Industrial Solutions. He looked at me in disbelief. You want to buy the entire company? I do. Victoria lowered her eyes back to the proposal. The purchase price was fair. More than fair, actually. Every independent valuation my team had conducted suggested the company was worth less than what we were offering. My CFO had argued against paying that much. Financially, he was right. But this decision had never been only about numbers. Victoria finally spoke. You could have waited. I nodded. Yes. You could have let us collapse. Yes. You would have bought everything for half this price. Probably. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. Then why didn't you? I answered without hesitation. Because I refuse to become the kind of person who measures another human being's value by the worst day of their life. The room fell silent again. She covered her mouth with one hand. For a moment, I thought she was going to cry. Instead, she laughed softly through her tears. I spent years believing wealth made me powerful. She looked around my office. And now the wealthiest person in this room is teaching me what character actually looks like. I didn't respond. Some lessons didn't need an answer. My attorney opened another folder. There are conditions. Victoria nodded immediately. I'm listening. The Henderson name will remain on the company for at least 5 years to protect employees and existing contracts. She looked surprised. I continued. There will be no mass layoffs. Several of her executives exchanged relieved glances. We're acquiring a business, not destroying families. Then I reached the final page. There's one last condition. Victoria looked directly at me. You will retire as CEO. She closed her eyes. For several seconds, she said nothing. When she finally spoke, I expected that. She signed the first page, then the second, then the third. When she reached the final signature line, she stopped. This company was my husband's dream. A single tear landed on the paper. I failed him. I gently shook my head. No. You failed to change. There's a difference. She nodded slowly. Then she signed. The deal was done. As everyone gathered their documents, Victoria remained seated. May I ask you one favor? I looked at her. Of course. Would you have dinner with me? Not as business partners. As family. The request caught me off guard. I didn't answer immediately. I'll think about it. She smiled. That's more than I deserve. 2 weeks later, the acquisition officially closed. The headlines were everywhere. Seattle tech firm acquires Henderson Industrial Solutions. Business reporters called it one of the most surprising acquisitions of the year. Very few people knew the real story behind it. I wanted to keep it that way. Not because I was ashamed. Because revenge had never been the headline. Growth was. 3 months after the acquisition, I received an invitation. Sunday dinner. My parents' house. The first family gathering in almost a decade. I almost declined. Then Dad called. It isn't about the past anymore. It's about what comes next. So I went. When I walked through my parents' front door, everything felt strangely familiar. Mom was cooking. Dad was setting the table. My cousins were talking in the living room. Then the front door opened. Victoria stepped inside. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. She carried a homemade apple pie. She looked ordinary. For the first time in my life. She looked approachable. The room became quiet. She walked straight toward my parents. Not me. toward my father. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she quietly said, "I'm sorry, Daniel. For everything." Dad looked at his older sister. He smiled the same gentle smile I had seen my entire life. "You took long enough." She laughed through her tears. "I know." Then my father hugged her. Just like that. Years of silence. Years of anger. Years of distance. They didn't disappear. But healing finally began. Later that evening, Victoria sat beside me on the back porch. "I have something for you." She handed me a small cardboard box. Inside was an old photograph. I recognized it immediately. It had been taken before money changed everything. My father, my aunt, my grandparents, all smiling together. Beneath the picture was a folded $1 bill. I looked at her, confused. She smiled sadly. "I found it in your grandmother's things." She wrote a note. I carefully unfolded the paper attached to it. In my grandmother's handwriting, it read, "Never let money decide who belongs at your table." I couldn't speak. Victoria quietly said, "I wish I had listened to her." That $1 bill now sits in a glass frame on the bookshelf in my office. Visitors often ask why I display something worth almost nothing. I always smile. Because they're wrong. It isn't worth $1. It's priceless. It reminds me that success isn't proving people wrong. It's proving that hardship doesn't have to change your heart. The greatest revenge wasn't watching my aunt lose her company. It was becoming someone who could have destroyed her, and choosing not to. Because real success isn't measured by how many people you defeat. It's measured by how many people you refuse to become. The end.